Having a life scholarship and being able to afford to go to college made me feel inspired to go.
When I got a life scholarship, it was such a relief.
I knew that I wanted to have an impact. Having a life scholarship through the SC Education Lottery was huge. It gave me the opportunity to make that impact right here at home.
The South Carolina Education Lottery. A better you, a better us, a better South Carolina. Visit sceducationlottery.com/betteryou.
Ready to make a real impact every day? Join the Active Day Home Care team and help clients maintain their independence in the comfort of their own homes. Make a difference in someone's life as you provide essential daily assistance and protect their health and happiness. Earn up to $20 an hour and enjoy additional perks like optional daily pay, 401k, paid time off, ongoing educational training, and more. Join a team that values care, compassion, and your professional growth. Visit activeday.com to apply.
Welcome to another Scotland Then episode. I know I normally release the Scotland Then episode after the episode about a murder case, but I thought I'd mix things up this month. So in this episode, I will tell you about some of the stories in the newspapers back in 1932, specifically from the Scotsman from the 1st of February, at the time of the murder of Elizabeth Campbell, and from the 25th of April, at the time of the murder trial. You'll hear about the murder of Elizabeth Campbell in Cowcaddens, Glasgow, and if she received justice next week. But before I take you back to 1932, which is the year my gran was born, and whose voice you'll hear at the end of each episode saying,
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurinton.
First, I'd love to introduce you to, if you aren't already a fan of his podcast, the fabulous and so kind Mike from the Murder Mile UK True Crime Podcast. I absolutely adore Mike, and the research he puts into each and every episode of his podcast is phenomenal. Mike really does care about each case he covers. He has a wicked and dry sense of humour, and you couldn't meet a nicer guy. So let's hear from the man himself.
Nominated as one of the best British true crime podcasts, Murder Mile is hailed as a masterpiece of compelling storytelling. Research using the original police files. Over 300 episodes, Murder Mile has covered hundreds of crimes you won't hear anywhere else, as well as solving cold cases, unearthing new evidence, and even discovering a serial killer no one even knew existed. For a truly original podcast, subscribe to Murder Mile.
Like I said, if you're not already listening to Mike's podcast, the Murder Mile UK True Crime Podcast, then I'd highly recommend giving it a listen, and you'll find a link in the show notes. Okay, so now let's get back to 1932 and find out some of the stories that were in the newspapers back then. So the first story that caught my eye was headed Kidnapped Baby, and the name Lindbergh jumped out at me. Now, I, like most, know the story of 20-month-old baby Charles Lindbergh being kidnapped on the 1st of March 1932 and later found murdered. But that happened in America, so why would I be telling you about this story? Well, what I didn't know was that baby Charles's nanny at the time he was kidnapped was 26-year-old Betty Gow, and that she was Scottish. Following the kidnapping, the finger of suspicion was quickly pointed at Betty, as she was the last person to have seen baby Charles before he was taken, and for several days she was subjected to grilling and criticism from police officers before she was eventually exonerated. And that was what the short article in the Scotsman was saying, that Betty Gow had been cleared of the slightest imputation upon her character. I wondered though, what happened to Betty Gow after she'd been cleared? So I did a bit more research. And it turns out that, according to an article from LindberghKidnappingHoax.com, that following Betty being cleared, she immediately returned back to Scotland, only returning again to America to take to the stand at the trial of the man who actually kidnapped and murdered baby Charles Lindbergh, before heading back to Scotland, Glasgow specifically, where she lived for the rest of her life in a smart terraced house, collected her modest pension each week, and lived an unobtrusive, quiet life, keeping her secret, her burden, from her neighbours. That was until she was 88 years old, when Andrew Scott Berg, who was writing an in-depth book titled Lindbergh, sought her out and asked her if she would speak to him for his book, having also spoken to the Lindberghs. Betty Gow eventually agreed, but upon Andrew arriving at her home, he found she would not open up to him, and feared he had had a wasted journey. That was until he told Betty that Mrs. Lindbergh had asked him to pass on her regards to Betty, to tell Betty that they appreciated her so much, that she had been fantastic with Charles while he was alive, and that they couldn't have asked for a better nanny. At which point Andrew said Betty began to cry, eventually telling him that she had always thought the Lindberghs had hated her and blamed her for Charles being kidnapped, and she'd lived with that all of her life, as she had written a note to the Lindberghs after she'd returned to Scotland, but they had never replied. Andrew explained to Betty that it was likely the Lindberghs had never received her note, as at the time they were receiving thousands of letters, good and bad, and that they had rarely been opening them. Andrew said he could visibly see the burden leaving Betty's shoulders at his words, and he was pleased he had been able to finally put her mind to rest after almost 61 years. Andrew said that Betty had gone on to be one of the most revealing sources for his book. Okay, so while I'm mentioning things happening outside of Scotland, I also noticed this short piece of information. Trigger warning though, it does involve the topic of suicide, so please skip past if you'd rather not listen. So it involves the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which opened to the public on the 19th of March 1932, and just over a month later, the Scotsman reported that on the 24th of April, the first suicide had occurred, when an unknown man threw himself from the railings and fell 190 feet. Okay, back to Scotland, but another tragedy, which sadly seems to have been the theme in this particular time period in 1932. This time, the headline in the Scotsman on the 25th of April read, "Fatal result of accident on football field." A friendly football game was taking place in Straven between Straven former pupils team and Hamilton postal employees, when 22-year-old Stuart Fleming was injured in a tackle. He was taken off the field and treated, but he did return, and he actually added to the Straven former pupils team's score. It didn't say what the score was that day, but after the game, Stuart complained of feeling unwell, so much so that he was taken to Victoria Infirmary in Glasgow, where he underwent an operation for abdominal injuries. Sadly, Stuart died following this surgery. Okay, so the next few stories taken from the Scotsman on the 1st of February and the 25th of April involve people who were tragically killed, but it was unknown who they were at the time. The first being a woman who was knocked down by a tram car in the evening of Wednesday the 20th of April 1932 in Southbridge, Edinburgh. She received serious injuries and sadly died a few days later in hospital, still not having been identified. She was reported to have been about 55 years old, about 5 foot 5 inches or 1.65 metres, have grey hair, be of slim build, and be wearing a grey woolen jumper with a grey-green skirt and coat. Then, on the 24th of April, the body of an elderly man was found at Inverness Harbour, who again had not been identified. It was said, though, that when he was taken ashore, he was found to have his legs tied together with rope and that weights had been attached to the rope. It was said that he likely had been in the water for about 3 weeks, but that no local person had been reported missing. Then back to Glasgow, where the body of a female child was said to have been discovered on a road in Maryhill, but police said that this child had likely been dead for a week. I'm not sure if it meant the child's body had been found on the side of the road or in a property on this road though. However, later the same afternoon, a man's body was recovered from the River Clyde after it had been seen floating in the river. The man was said to have been between 45 and 50 years old and be about 5 foot 10 inches or 1.77 metres in height. I'm not sure if these two cases were connected or not. I do hope, however, that everyone was identified and laid to rest. Staying in Glasgow now, the tragedies continued when 9-year-old Francis Connolly of Loom Street was killed when a wall collapsed on him. Apparently part of a property in Loom Street was being prepared to be demolished, and 9-year-old Francis was in his front room when a beam supporting presumably the brick wall to his home was dislodged, and the wall collapsed on Francis, burying him. He was still alive at this point and was heard to be screaming, and the workmen working on preparing the adjacent building for demolition immediately rushed to his aid and managed to get Francis out. An ambulance was called and Francis was rushed to hospital. However, he died en route from the injuries he had sustained. The tragedies continued in Glasgow in this time period, with it being reported in the Scotsman on the 25th of April that over that weekend there had been multiple accidents and fatalities. Firstly, when 32-year-old Ernest Keith Humphreys, who was driving his motorcycle and sidecar with a passenger along Maryhill Road, lost control and he was thrown to the ground. Ernest sadly sustained a fractured skull and he died at the scene. His passenger, however, escaped the sidecar with no injuries. Then Mrs. Bennett, an elderly lady, was knocked down by a motorcycle on Great Western Road. She received serious head injuries and was taken to hospital and was reported to be in a critical condition, but I couldn't find if Mrs. Bennett survived her injuries. 5 people were also injured when a car collided with a lorry loaded with milk cans at the juncture of Kingston Street and Commerce Street in Glasgow. In the car was Andrew Shearer, his wife Elizabeth and their children Andrew 10 and Cathy 11, as well as a neighbour they had given a lift to, Mrs. Armstrong of Dalmarnock Road. It was reported that everyone sustained cuts and bruises except 10-year-old Andrew, who also sustained head injuries and was reported to be in serious condition. While the car was completely wrecked, the lorry only sustained slight damage, and there was no mention of the lorry driver having sustained any injuries. Apparently, though, the road was closed for quite a time, while passers-by helped collect the milk cans, which had been scattered in all directions, and replaced them back on the lorry. The next accident involved 15-year-old Mary Henderson, who, while happily playing on a stair banister on the 3rd floor of her close, fell to the basement, sustaining severe head injuries. Again, I couldn't find out what happened to Mary, but it sounds a pretty nasty fall. And finally, a murder charge. George Dollin, a young seaman, was at Glasgow Sheriff Court being charged, according to the Scotsman on the 1st of February, that on the 23rd or 24th of January he assaulted 40-year-old Mary Lydon or Aitken at his home in Kingston Street, Glasgow, seized hold of her, compressed her throat with his hands, threw her to the ground, beat her on the head, face and body with his fists, fractured one of her ribs and murdered her. At this time, George Dollin's representative made no plea, and George Dollin was committed to prison for further examination. And that was it. So, of course, I did some research to find out a bit more and find out what the outcome was. Well, the murder trial took place in April, and it was quite the spectacle, apparently, with a large number of people turning up for each day of the trial, and many having to be turned away. So it appears that Mary Lydon or Aitken had been married at the time of her murder to another man, but had left him and was cohabiting with George Dollin. At the trial, Mary's sister-in-law spoke of many quarrels between Mary and George, and how her and her husband had in fact witnessed George being violent towards Mary, on one occasion hitting Mary on the eye. But George would always beg Mary to stay with him, promising to behave in future. Mary's sister-in-law also disclosed at the trial that Mary was fed up with George and had actually secured herself a house as she wanted a place of her own. Mary's sister-in-law went on to say that Mary had told her she paid for the rent for this house with parish money. Following a post-mortem, it was concluded that Mary's death was due to shock and heart failure by numerous injuries on the face, scalp and neck, and from a fracture of a rib. George's counsel did try to sway the jury and ask them to return a verdict of culpable homicide and not murder. However, following deliberation, the jury, by a majority, returned a verdict of guilty of murder, and George Dollin was sentenced to death. This verdict was immediately appealed, with it being felt that the verdict was unreasonable, and that George should have been found guilty of culpable homicide and not murder. And the case appeared in front of the Criminal Appeal Court in Edinburgh in May. However, this appeal was unanimously dismissed, and George Dollin's execution was set for the 4th of June. A reprieve of this death sentence was sought, but it wouldn't be until the 2nd of June, 2 days before his execution date, that George Dollin calmly and gratefully received this news, with him instead sentenced to penal servitude for life. So that's just some newspaper stories from February and April 1932, but there were so many stories that I just couldn't tell you. If you're interested in finding out more about what happened in the past, the website I use for research is the British Newspaper Archive, and you'll find an affiliate link in the show notes, or by visiting scottishmurders.com. I hope you enjoyed this week's Scotland Then episode from 1932. Like I said, next week I'll be releasing an episode about the murder of Elizabeth Campbell in 1932 in Glasgow. Later in July, I will be covering the solved/unsolved case, and you'll have to listen to find out what I mean by that, of Aileen Printie in Edinburgh in 1981, which is a case requested by one of our listeners. We've also had another request from a listener on YouTube Music, asking if I could provide any further information about the unsolved murder of George Nixon Martin, a case I briefly touched on in another Scotland Then episode. So, CH1K13, I'll do a bit more research into that case and put together an episode about George Nixon Martin's murder, as it is still unsolved, and I hope to release that episode later in July or in early August. So, lots still to come, but until then, I've been your host, Dawn.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurinton.
Breaking news from the stadium tonight as an anonymous fan foot the bill for 55,000 hot dogs, bringing that sweet tubed meat to everyone in attendance.
Free dogs! Yeah!
55,000 hot dogs? What does that even cost?
While the identity of this Frankfurter philanthropist remains anonymous, their all-beefy generosity will go down in history.
The new Mega Millions. More to win means more to give. How you spend it is up to you.
Yeah!
For game odds and details, visit sceducationlottery.com.